Hello there, friends. My name is Natalia, and I'm an educator with the Cincinnati Observatory, and today we are going to be talking about nebulas. So you've probably seen pictures like this before, and these are all pictures of nebulas. And so a nebula is basically a big cloud of dust and gas in outer space, and they're really, really cool looking. And so all of these pictures show that nebulas can be many different shapes, many different colors, and some of them can even create stars. So some nebulas we like to call star factories because they are the places where stars are born. Now, not all nebulas do this, but that's something else that's cool about nebulas is that there are many different types, and depending on what type you have, that decides what color it is, what shape it is, and also whether or not it produces stars. And so nebulas are kind of interesting because if you flew a spaceship out into outer space and you took a look at one of these nebulas, then some of the nebulas would look just as bright and colorful as you see in these beautiful pictures. But some of them wouldn't look nearly as bright. Some of them you wouldn't be able to see at all. And that's because there are a lot of nebulas that are made out of light that is not on the visible light spectrum. And basically what that means is that there are certain colors in outer space that we cannot see. And so what scientists will do is they'll take pictures of these nebulas that are made out of these invisible colors, and they will add colors to them on their computer so that we can see the shape of what the nebula would look like if we could see it. So we're going to start off by talking about nebulas that create stars. Now you may be wondering, well, how do these nebulas create stars? How does this really, really hot star come out of a fluffy cloud? And basically what happens is gravity starts to pull gas and dust in and begins to compress it. So really push it in and put a lot of pressure on it. And as that happens, the dust and the gas starts to get really, really hot, and it starts to spin around like you see in this image here. And eventually it gets so hot that it starts a nuclear reaction, and this creates a baby star. Now you may be wondering, well, if nebulas create stars, how big are they? And to answer that question, I think first we need to see how big our planet is compared to stars. So if this is how big the star in our solar system is, so the sun, if this is how big the sun is, then that is how big Earth is, this tiny blue dot. So you could fit about 1,000,000 Earths inside of the sun. So obviously the sun is a lot bigger than our planet and all the other planets inside of our solar system. Now imagine if you had thousands of stars that were just as big as our sun or even bigger, just like in this picture. That is how many stars nebulas can produce. They can produce thousands. So do you think that nebulas are pretty big? I think so too. So let's take a look for a second at what happens to these stars after they leave the nebula. And so stars have entire life cycles, just like humans do. So if you think about humans, we start off as babies, and then we become kids, and then we become teenagers, and then we become adults. Well, stars have their own life cycle just like that, but it depends on how big the star is, what happens during its lifetime. So if you have a regular sized star, then towards the end of its life, it is going to get a lot bigger, and it's going to get a lot colder, and it's going to turn red and turn into something called a red giant. And then from there, it turns back into a nebula. Now, if you have a larger star, this is not what happens at all. So if you have a really big star, towards the end of its life, it also gets bigger and colder and turns kind of a reddish orangish color. But then after that, instead of turning back into a nebula at the end of its life, it turns into a supernova, which basically means the star explodes. It's a really gigantic explosion. And then from there, sometimes it'll even turn into a black hole. Now, black holes are not very big. However, they are the most intense gravity that exists in all of the universe. And so that's pretty cool. So you may be wondering then what's going to happen to our star, the sun, at the end of its life cycle? Well, our star is a medium-sized star. And so because of that, it is going to turn into a nebula. So we have plenty of time before this happens. That's not going to happen for another 5 billion years or so. So our sun's life started off inside of a nebula, and then from that nebula, our star was born, and all of the solar system is just the leftover bits and pieces from when our star was born. And then right now, we are a solar system, and then eventually at the end of the sun's life, it will expand, turn into a red dwarf, and then from there, turn back into a nebula. So it's kind of hard sometimes for scientists to be able to tell that a new star is being born inside of a nebula because it will have this big disk of gas around it. So kind of like when we saw all the way back in this picture here, this disk of gas happens around the star as it's being formed. And so scientists, when they see a really dark line of gas like this, that usually indicates that there are new stars being born inside of this nebula. And you can start to tell towards the end because, as you can see, there's this really bright light from the star coming out of the gases as the gases break apart.
All right, my friends, so we are going to do some solar viewing. So we are going to use a telescope in order to look at the sun today. Now you may be thinking, well, isn't that dangerous? If you don't have any kind of equipment to put on your telescope to make solar viewing safe, then yes, it could really damage your eyes. However, we have something that we've put here on our telescope that is going to help us view the sun safely today. This is called a sun funnel, and basically this just attaches to the eyepiece of the telescope so that it can show us a projection of what the sun looks like. And so here it is. You guys might be picking up a little bit of a glare, but this is what the sun looks like through our telescope. And something that you'll notice is that as time goes on, the sun slowly moves out of view, and that's because the earth is moving, and it makes it look like everything in our skies are moving. And so because of that, you'll have to occasionally adjust your telescope so that it can follow whatever it is that you are trying to look at. The great thing about this sun funnel is that if there are sunspots on the sun, then it will show us those sunspots.
All right, my friends, so you might remember that we mentioned earlier how there are many different types of nebulas, and depending on what type of nebula you have, that controls what it looks like and whether or not it produces stars. So we're going to talk for a minute about what each of these different types of nebula are. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this because after this, we're going to quiz you a little bit and see if you can remember what each kind of nebula looks like. All right, so the first kind of nebula that we're going to talk about today is called emission nebula. And so emission nebula usually look red, and they do form stars. Now, our next nebula is called reflection nebula. And just like emission nebula, they do form stars, but instead of looking red, they look blue. And that is how you can tell these two star-producing nebulas apart. Now, the next kind of nebula does not produce stars, and those are called dark nebula. And the way you can tell dark nebula apart from these two types of nebula is that they look just like what they sound like. They are dark. They're usually blackish or grayish clouds, and a lot of times you're not even able to see them unless there's some sort of significant light source behind them so that you can see their silhouette. The next type of nebula also does not produce stars, and this is planetary nebula. And so planetary nebulas are made from the death of stars. So remember how we talked about earlier how eventually the sun is going to turn into a nebula? Well, it's going to turn into a planetary nebula, and you can usually tell these apart from the other types of nebula that we just talked about because they usually look round. And the last kind of nebula we're going to talk about are called supernova. And so this is what happens at the end of a large star's life. Instead of turning into one of the nebulas that we talked about previously, they turn into a big giant explosion. All right, so this is the first kind of nebula that we are going to be looking at. So this is called the Rossette Nebula, which I feel is very fitting because it kind of looks like a rose. And so what kind of nebula do you think this is? Remember, it's red. What kind of nebulas usually look red? If you guessed emission nebula, then you are correct. And remember, emission nebula produce stars. Alright, so the next nebula that we're going to be looking at is called the Horsehead Nebula, and that's because to a lot of people this looks like a witch. So if you look at the profile here, this kind of looks like the witch's forehead, this is the witch's nose, this is the witch's mouth, and this is the witch's chin, and then this is the hat. So you kind of got to use your imagination, but I definitely see the witch in this nebula. So what kind of nebula do you think this is? Remember, it's blue. What kind of nebulas look blue? If you're thinking reflection nebula, then you are correct. And remember, reflection nebula also produce stars. Now this one is a little confusing. This is called the Horsehead Nebula because this right here, this part is the Horsehead Nebula. And so you kind of have to ignore this nebula behind it because this red is from a completely different nebula. So just focus on this blackish grayish part here. Do you remember what kind of nebulas look kind of black or gray? If you guessed dark nebula, then you are correct. And remember, dark nebulas do not produce stars. Alright, so this is called the Eye Nebula, and it's a little bit round. So if you see, it kind of looks like it's made out of a lot of bubbles or circular shapes. So what kind of nebula is usually round? If you guessed planetary nebula, you are correct. So remember, planetary nebula come from the end of a star's life. So here in the middle of this planetary nebula, you can see there is a star in the middle. Alright, what kind of nebula do you think this is? This is called the Crab Nebula. This one's a little tricky. It kind of looks like an explosion. Do you guys remember what kind of nebula is an explosion? If you guessed supernova, you are correct. So this is what happens at the end of a massive star's life cycle. Alright, this one is a little tricky too. This one's called Butterfly Nebula, and you can see it looks kind of like it's got wings, which is pretty cool. Now this one's a little bit tricky because it doesn't really fit any of the descriptions that we've gone through thus far perfectly, but each one of these shapes, at least to me, kind of looks a little round. Do we remember what kind of nebula makes round shapes? Remember, planetary nebula make round shapes, and so the Butterfly Nebula is a planetary nebula. And then this one is Orion's Nebula, and it's called Orion's Nebula because it sits right below Orion's belt in the constellation Orion. So take a look at this and think about what kind of nebula you think this might be. Now you might notice there's some blue in here and there's also some red as well, and in certain areas they mix together to create purple. So this was kind of a trick question because there's one type of nebula that I hadn't brought up to you guys yet, and that is called a diffuse nebula, which means it's basically a combination of multiple different types of nebula. So since this has some blue and some red in it, then you probably think, well, this is a mix of an emission nebula and a reflection nebula. Alright, my friends, we are going to end today by looking at the inside of Orion's Nebula. Now, this is not an actual video that anybody took, but this is what we think the inside of Orion's Nebula would look like. So look at all of the stars that are inside of this nebula. A lot of these stars would be just as big or even bigger than our sun. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you are interested in other things that the observatory is up to, be sure to check out our website at www.cincinnatiobservatory.org and check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.